Do you want to do the interlude between these two sections, or?
Do we have interlude? Yeah, I guess probably do have interludes, don't we?
Oh, I'm glad you listen every week.
I do listen.
Yeah, we do.
Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Marketers of the Universe podcast. It is 2025, which is terrifying. It feels like some kind of sci-fi dystopia out here in the world right now. Our episode today is looking at some of the most important things that you can be doing when it comes to upskilling and improving as a marketer. We're looking at why training matters to both your careers, to the wider team, and how you can train and upskill now that it's 2025 and we've all got our New Year's resolutions rolling on. In addition to that, we are being a little bit self-obsessed and looking back on the last 18 months of podcasting. We are reflecting just on what we've learned from the last year and a half of running this podcast, the mistakes we've made and how you can learn from them if you're launching or running a podcast yourself. And we'll also look at what is potentially in the future for Marketers of the Universe. For now, though, let's jump straight into the topics. Let's get on with the podcast. Our first session is called The Learning Edge, Essential Skills for Modern Marketers. Leading this section is Nasya Nasseira, so I will pass over to her to lead the way.
Hello. Welcome to this episode of Marketers of the Universe. Thank you, Haydn, for that introduction. I'm your host, Nasya Nasseira, and today we're focusing on one of the most important aspects of any stage of your career, training. Yep, we're talking all things upskilling, why it's a total game changer for your career, and how to level up in the new year. New year, new you. And with me, I've got two fantastic guests with me today who may know a thing or two about upskilling. First, we have Mark Bundle, the mastermind behind the email strategy here at Brew Digital, and Freya behind our fun and colorful social media planning. Welcome both. Happy to have you here. Let's get straight into it. We've all heard this a gazillion times. No matter where you're at in your career, training is essential. Why do we place such emphasis on training, especially in marketing? Why not just Google things as we go and call it a day? Mark, Freya, what do you think?
I mean, to be fair, Googling things is still training. It's just a very, very unofficial way of doing it. Anything that you're finding out, more information, more that you can learn and use and develop, is still training. So, I mean, there's different methods of training or different ways of learning are visual, doing, and audio, or a grouping of the three. So I guess it's the best way of doing it is whichever way works for you. So me personally, I'm a visual learner, so I love a video, or I love reading books. And those are the best ways to get stuff into me. But a lot of other people, there are other ways they're going to probably prefer doing it.
Yeah, I'm definitely like a physical learner. Like I have to do it to understand it. It's why I'm awful at flat pack furniture, because reading those instructions just doesn't do it for me. But I'd say, yeah, Googling is a form of learning, but also I think learning is so important because as like marketers, the digital marketing world is changing and developing so much. But if you don't dedicate time to learning, you are just going to get lost in those sort of stagnant beliefs and you're not going to be able to develop and keep up with what's happening.
Thank you both. I love that answers. And like for me personally, training is essential. And it's kind of like trying to run a marathon without training first. You're just making it absolutely harder for yourself. But thank you both. Mark, my second question is for you. Obviously, you've got a team to look after. By team, you and Freya work very, very closely. And also you have a lot of accounts under you, and I imagine it's not an easy task. What are some ways of how you juggle your work, and also how do you encourage your team, your colleagues to develop?
Yeah, the juggling between work and training, especially if you are a small team or if you're working on your own, is really difficult. Dedicated time is going to be the thing I say is put time in your diary to learn and absolutely fortify that time. Do not let it be breached. Don't let a meeting overrun into it. Don't go, oh no, it's fine, I can take one little thing. Set your learning time and keep to it. Sure, anything absolutely critical. If you don't find that time and a good block of time, you're not going to be able to commit to things. You're not going to be able to spend enough time learning. I know you can do micro learning in really short bursts and things, but generally you want to spend a little bit of time with something so you can kind of go over it and potentially repeat it. In terms of encouraging others to do the same, again, that advice to block time is, I think, really key. Freya will probably tell you, don't really reinforce her trying to learn anything, but then she's pretty good at doing it off her own back. That, I think, is probably an important message as well. It's as much as your manager or your director or whoever can encourage you to go and learn stuff, learning is a central process. It is your learning. You need to be in control of it. You know what's going to benefit you. So unless you're told, go off and learn SQL because it's going to benefit your job role, if you're doing independent learning, you know what you want to learn, and it's up to you to make time to do that.
I like the points that you make. Blocking time is definitely key, and I like when you mention and putting emphasis on having that control of your own learning. And it's something that Haydn usually talks about in my one-to-one with him as well. Yeah, you got to have that consistent discipline, blocking your time, and dedicate a few hours within a week. So for my next question, since both of you have shared some great tips there, let's talk about balance in marketing, especially when it comes to social media. There's always something new to learn, some new tools out there, but there's also the need to master what we already know. Is there a right mix between like picking up new skills, staying on trend, and enhancing existing ones? Freya, could you tell me more about your experience and how you balance both?
Yeah, that's a really good question. For me, so obviously I work for Mark. I do a lot of like HubSpot based work, and HubSpot is complicated. Like at its core, it is just complicated. So when I first started at Brew, way back last year, I did a training course that Mark created, and I refreshed myself with that probably every 3 months, every 2 months. Sometimes if I just want to sort of refresh and make sure I am doing everything correctly and sort of in the correct processes, I will just go back and watch that initial training, and I could probably recite it word for word now, and Mark is actually updating it. So yeah, but it's really useful to just have that documented, and I can go back and sort of confirm that I know what I know. And then for sort of updating my skills, I love LinkedIn to like look for webinars and look for courses that might interest me or might benefit my job role. I did one recently. I love the girls in marketing. They're so great, and they do loads of sort of either free courses or webinars that you can just go along, and the social media are really good. They talk about SEO and how to sort of set yourself up for 2025. And I think actively searching for stuff like that is so important when it comes to boosting your learning. And like Mark said, knowing what you want to learn, like you actively have to search for things to learn for if you're doing self-led learning.
Thank you, Freya. Yeah, thank you for the tips and your personal experience when it comes to the balancing. Document your training. It's important. And yeah, shout out to girls in marketing. Since now we're in the new year, I'm curious to know, because one, I'm nosy, and I'm sure our listeners out there would like to know as well. What are some things you're looking to learn in 2025? What's your main focus for this year that excites you? Let's start with Mark.
So for 2025, mine's less hard skill based this year. I'm quite happy where I am in terms of what I can do for my job. but my soft skills are not as strong. So I'm working on like being able to present myself in a more positive way, being able to interact with people more positively, having a more positive mindset, that kind of thing. Because that's just as important as kind of the hard skills. It doesn't matter what you can do if you can't actually get that point across to people and be persuasive with it. So yeah, that's my focus. I think is the soft skills and the perception of self.
How about you, Freya?
Yeah, so for 2025, I think I'd really like to learn more about SEO so that I can sort of bring it into the social media work that I do, because I feel like I do focus a lot of my training on email and CRM, when in reality, social media is what changes so much and it changes so quickly. And so I'd love to learn more about writing alt text and whether it boosts our engagement or whether it doesn't, and just spend more time looking over our Instagram, because that Instagram is literally like my child. I love that thing, and seeing ways that I can sort of truly optimize it with all these skills that I've learned since being at Brew.
That's really amazing, both. Your list to do has inspired me to kind of level up my own training as well. And listening to you both, it kind of puts me on the spot because my 2025 list is kind of short, but thank you. Before we wrap up the session, for anyone listening who's inspired to learn more after this episode, where should they go? What are some of your favorite learning resources that they could check out? If you were to give your top 3.
That's really tough. I'd say if it's hard skills you're trying to learn, whatever software it is you're using probably has a great academy. Start there. So for HubSpot, the HubSpot Academy is phenomenal. It covers so much stuff. As we mentioned, Google is a resource to try and find other kind of places. Blogs are a really good thing. Most places will have like sounding boards or forums or kind of communities that you can learn an awful lot from. Again, just going back to HubSpot as an example, they have the Sprocket community. It's not led by them at all, but it's just loads and loads of HubSpot people kind of coming together to chat, learn, discuss problems. And then, you know what, I'm going to sound proper old-fashioned here, but you cannot be a library. Books are still a really great place to go to learn stuff. There are still books being written on all of the kind of contemporary problems and issues and trainings. So yeah, especially if you're a visual learner, don't neglect your local library.
I love that. You cannot beat a library. I don't think I've set foot in a library since I was at university. I won't lie. But maybe that'll be my New Year's resolution, spend more time in libraries. I really like I said, LinkedIn and Udemy. I've done some HubSpot training courses as well. They're really good. And we actually have so much stuff on our resource hub now. Like, we've built it out so well. It's got so much stuff. It's really lots of interesting documents as well. And I love sort of learning about our team on there as well, because some of the people I don't work that close with, they have profiles on there, which is so cool. But I definitely say, yeah, keep an eye out on LinkedIn and keep an eye out on Udemy, especially if you're looking for sort of social media trends and stuff. So many 2025 updates have come out and they're really useful places to be.
Thank you so much, both. And thank you, Freya, for giving a shout out to Brew's Resource Hub. So anyone of our dear listeners, for any little nuggets of information, please check out our Brews Resource Hub. And also, that's all the time we have for today. Huge thanks to Mark and Freya for joining us. You had so many great takeaways on why training isn't just a nice to have, but also an absolute must. Whether it's picking up new skills, sharpening old ones, or just figuring out where to start, the key is to keep on learning and have that discipline. So go sign up for that course, watch that YouTube tutorial, webinars, or just start experimenting. Your future self will thank you.
Thank you, Nasya, Mark, and Freya. That was really great. I think there's so much to take into our next conversation from learnings, because we are going to take a look back at the last 18 months of running the Marketers of the Universe podcast. Hopefully there are things for you to learn from what we have done in the last 18 months. If you do find it too much, keep on listening, because by the end it's less cringy. with me to talk about the last 18 months is our content marketing manager, Tom Innes. Tom is the most important part of this podcast. He is involved in creating the content, in editing the content, and keeping me in line when I talk a load of rubbish. So, Tom, are you excited about talking about our last 18 months?
Yeah, very much so. I always feel like a bit of an imposter because I sort of stepped into this role, but this podcast was kind of going beforehand, and like we've evolved it over the years, and we'll talk about that. But as somebody that joined late to the podcast party at Brew, I just thought it'd be really interesting to start off with how this podcast came about. Why did you start it? And did you have any objectives at the time?
Yeah, it's a good question. We started the podcast back in, I think it was January 2022, maybe 2023. Time kind of has been a bit of a whirlwind the last few years. But it actually started as a reporting call for a client. We had a very big client we work very closely with, who we deliver performance reports to across the main digital marketing channels. And we were trying to think of ways to actually encourage more engagement with that reporting. I think sometimes when working for an agency, if you've got a client that doesn't engage massively, then it can be really challenging to make sure they're listening to the learnings. So to make sure they're listening to the learnings and applying them and actually taking time to listen to what was going on. What we found when we did that was it was really helping grow our confidence as marketers to present externally and to present and talk. And it also helped cement knowledge inside ourselves of that we actually knew what we were talking about. I know that sounds quite silly, but I think many people in marketing and many industries suffer from imposter syndrome, and actually getting out and talking and putting your words into the world can really help with that. But to cut my very, very long story short, we kind of turned it into a podcast and then realized actually that this podcast could become a content machine for growing the Brew website, improving our SEO performance. And those were the main objectives from the start. It wasn't about bringing more people to listen to the podcast. Obviously, that's great. We want people to listen to it. But it was about how we can repurpose the podcast to create more and more content for our website and for our customers and prospective customers.
That's like a really interesting history. And it's always interesting to hear people's opinions on reporting as well. And turning a report into a podcast is a pretty, it's quite a creative approach to something that is quite dry as well. And yeah, tying back into that learnings, it's always useful to be able to demonstrate your knowledge and expertise. But when you're working remotely, being able to just share ideas, it advances your ability passively as well, just that sharing of ideas and challenges of opinion. Because it can be quite easy to sit in a bubble, especially when you're on your own all day.
I think this is one of the things that has been massive in the growth of the podcast and how everyone who's been on the podcast has grown is those first 10, maybe 15 episodes. No one wanted to disagree with each other. And that's what creates interesting content. Disagreeing, having that kind of back and forth, interrupting people like I just interrupted you. Carry on what you were saying.
So that's how the podcast started. We're now 18 months down the road. Do you feel like those objectives have changed at all? Are we just creating content for the sake of the Resource Hub, or has the podcast now taken on a life of its own and it's something that Brew creates?
Yeah, I think it definitely has. And obviously you want people to listen to the podcast, but actually one of the biggest bits of advice I could give to someone who's starting a podcast is no one listens. You know, you go through episodes where no one's really listening. You're getting, 10, 20 listens per episode. But then it suddenly starts growing as people start finding the content. And that's what we've seen. And it's been massive in validating that people enjoy this content. And because we've kind of validated that, it definitely has taken on a life of its own. So yes, it still feeds our Resource Hub and our social content, but actually it's now a piece of standalone content that people look for and people reach out to us about fairly often.
Yeah, it's great marketing in its own right. So this seems to be like an episode of learning, which is quite nice for the start of the year. And I think we adopt a bit of a learning-based iterative approach to podcasting. So from, those first early episodes, which were quite crowded, to where we are now, there's been a lot of changes to structure and format. Could you just talk through some of those changes and the rationale behind them? Like, why did we make those changes? What did we learn to then require those changes?
Yeah, absolutely. If you go back to those early episodes, we were running 4 topics an episode, maybe 5 at some points. And we were trying to squeeze everyone to have an opinion on everything. And it really, as you said, was so busy. If you were listening to that, it's very difficult to identify who is speaking. And this is actually where, you said you feel like a bit of an imposter to the podcast. This is where you helped steer us in the right direction, because Tom, you came in and listened to it and gave so many good opinions and so many constructive bits of feedback that allowed us to go, okay, let's make these changes. Let's do this little change now for this next episode. And I think we've seen, as we've released more and more episodes, that topics are getting tighter post-edit. We've seen that we are getting a bit more detailed. We're getting more in-depth in these topics. And I think that's really important, because so much of what happens now in the marketing world, in the whole world really, is we spend our time repeating headlines. And what we don't want this to be is a podcast that lacks depth and only repeats the latest headlines that people are seeing on LinkedIn.
No, absolutely. I'm eager for us to be as far away from the LinkedIn bros as possible, regurgitating just like nonsense. I'm going to call them all out. It's just nonsense that they spout on there with absolutely like no bearing on real life. And I don't know, like almost like that faux positivity as well. I think like marketing, you're speaking to humans, and humans are inherently just messy and complicated. And I think not everything goes perfectly, and being able to acknowledge that as well, as we have so many times in this podcast, those I leave in anyway. So what have we got coming up for 2025? How is this podcast going to evolve over the coming year?
The big thing that we are working on at the moment is just creating a slightly fuller brand for the podcast. That is just going to allow us to step a little bit away from Brew Digital and allow it to kind of have a life of its own. I think that's really important in making sure that we're sharing knowledge that is not necessarily directly attached to Brew. I think that's really important, because people don't want to hear about Brew right now. Like, you're here to learn. We're not here to sell you stuff at this point. That's how marketing works, right? So that's one thing, and that's going to be allow us to share shorter snippets. It's going to allow us to create longer pieces of content that can actually be shared. On top of that, we're really looking at how we can expand our panel. So we're very lucky within Brew that we have a lot of experts across digital marketing, development, and design. Plus, we have access to people within the Adaptivist group as well, who are our parent company. But what we want to do is actually look outside of those circles and start bringing in some voices from the wider marketing world. Maybe even some of those LinkedIn bros for you to have a kind of online duel with.
Delightful. I look forward to that immensely.
I'll be disappointed if we make it happen, by the way.
If we don't make it happen, oh, well, we'll see how that goes then, shall we? As the one who has to arrange this podcast, maybe as this year's Christmas treat, I will bring on a LinkedIn bro. We can grill him together. Sorry, that's very presumptive. It might be a her, but it's never a her, is it?
Yeah, he's white. He's got a beard.
He's got a beard and opinions, and he's ready to share them. So I think 2025 is going to be the year of the podcast. I feel the medium is really stepping into its own now, and everybody seems to have a podcast as well. But are there any particular podcasts that you feel are smashing it right now? They don't necessarily have to be marketing, although obviously that would be useful for our audience. But what do you tend to listen to that you want to draw attention to?
So I'm actually going to touch, before I go into my drawer of podcasts that I listen to, which are definitely not all marketing ones. I want to acknowledge the section or the bit you said about, being podcast year. I think it's so interesting how we have, when you look at podcasts, they're not really regulated. So what is said on a podcast is great for free speech. So we're here discussing whatever we want. But if we look at Zuckerberg's recent announcement, and I'm sure we've got a piece coming up about that, I'd even, bet my hat on it. That is all about losing that regulation of the content, right? And having less kind of fact checking. But there's no fact checking that goes on in podcasts. So, and interestingly, when I spoke last year on a podcast for the drum that was sponsored by Spotify, that was talking around how podcasters tend to be the most influential influencers. So I think there is a lot of space in podcasting for free speech. And I think with X being more open, with Meta's channels being more open, I think there might be a move into those channels with these big opinions. That was a big tangent. I'm very sorry.
I think it's really interesting that you talk about free speech there. That's going to be another thing that's going to be massive in conversations this year. As you mentioned, Meta has already decided to start walking back all of their content moderation and is leaving it up to the user. X has already dropped that in favor of community notes. And in all instances, I think we've seen products get worse as a result of that. And I wish I'd had this thought myself, but I will attribute it to Nilay Patel, the editor-in-chief of The Verge, who's always said that in social media instances, moderation is actually the product. Choosing the places where the moderation meets your needs and your tolerance for like horrendous content. And I think we will probably see the same start to happen in podcasts as well. I mean, we've seen little elements of that. Apple and other podcast players removed, for instance, Alex Jones's podcast, InfoWars, in the aftermath of his Sandy Hook podcast. So there's little bits of regulation there. Will we see more? Probably not immediately, but as podcasts continue to grow in importance and influence, I think people might start to turn their attention to it.
I think, you can't ignore what's happened with Stephen Butler and the Diary of the CEO podcast as well at the end of last year, where suddenly hit the mainstream that there's so many wild health conversations happening on that podcast. And this is going to be a point where actually I'm going to bring this back to podcasts that I listen to. We've gone full circle. I've never listened to the Diary of a CEO podcast. So that's the first one. So that's not on my recommended list. What I do really enjoy listening to is Exposure Ninja. They're an agency. I think in the Midlands, they do a really good podcast called the Digital Marketing Podcast. On top of that, the Marketing Society's podcast is always interesting. They have a little bit more of an environmental view on things, environmental angle to the podcast, which is always really interesting. And they often bring in marketers who are doing really good work when it comes to improving environmentalism. Outside of that, over the last year, I've listened to a couple of parenting podcasts that I won't talk about here, but that's definitely helped with my transition from not a dad to being a dad. And also, I've always been a big fan of the No Such Thing as a Fish podcast. And going all the way back to when we first launched this one, actually that kind of research a topic, discuss the topic, research a topic, discuss the topic. The influence of how we run this podcast came from No Such Thing as a Fish.
Everybody references that podcast as inspiration. It's just like, that's the gold standard of podcast, I think.
God damn, I'm so cliche.
It's all right. You've not got a beard. Oh,
I got bubble onions. I'm going to put them on LinkedIn. Oh.
I have nowhere to go with this. So I'm going to just say thank you so much for indulging us, dear listener. And thank you, Haydn, also for coming in and talking about what we're trying to achieve with this podcast. And hopefully everybody feels that we are at least providing value from an education point of view. And if not, it's entertaining.
Absolutely. And if you hate what we're doing, send us an email and tell us why. I love getting hate mail in 2025. That is all we've got time for on today's podcast. I am leaving it in the hands of Tom Innes to edit how much of this conversation you have just heard. So if it was really nice, thank you. We're really nice. If you see that we are this disorganized mess, leave this podcast knowing that every single business that you go into as an employee or working with clients or as an agency are kind of a little bit of a mess. And that's just the world. We're all just doing our best. If you enjoyed what was on this podcast, please do recommend to a friend or a colleague. We love making this content and love that people share it. Beyond that, thank you to our brew team for all of their research on the podcast. And we will see you on the next one. I've been Haydn, and these guys are the Marketers of the Universe. Are you excited about editing that shit show of a interlude?
Always. Always. It's better than keeping it in, right?